You think firing the person standing in your way is the fastest route to the top? Julian certainly thought so, right up until he realized my termination papers were actually a death sentence for his entire company. People like me do not yell when backed into a corner. We simply smile, pack our desks, and let federal regulations do the heavy lifting. Let me show you how I turned getting fired into a lethal trap for corporate greed. Hello and sincerely welcome to Boss Revenge Stories. We want to thank you for tuning in today, but we need to share that YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the necessary budget to keep our operations running. If you find yourself enjoying today's story, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon community, where you can listen to exclusive, true stories that are significantly longer and feature detailed situations and multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot release publicly on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link located in the description or the comments section of this video. Now, let us begin today's story, and let me introduce you to my world as Quinn Collins. I am 38 years old, and until recently, I held the position of Compliance Director at Aegis Biomech, located in the crisp altitude of Denver. Aegis was a heavyweight in the medical technology sector, specializing in the design and manufacturing of cardiac pacemakers and highly sensitive neural implants. If you walk into a place like that expecting to make friends, you will not last a single week. I was never there to exchange pleasantries at the coffee machine or attend Friday social events. I was built to be a firewall. Over the course of 6 grueling years, my relentless meticulousness served as the absolute defense mechanism for the corporation. I single-handedly intercepted 4 separate federal investigations before they could materialize, and I shielded the company from countless lawsuits that would have buried them under mountains of catastrophic debt. The air inside Aegis Biomech always smelled of sterile alcohol and raw ambition, a dangerous combination if left unchecked. A prime example of my daily reality occurred just a few months prior. I made the executive decision to completely suspend the entire assembly line for our newest generation of pacemakers. Hundreds of workers were ordered to power down their stations, stopping millions of dollars of productivity in its tracks. The reason for my drastic action was a slight anomaly I discovered during a routine audit. I found that the micro-bubble leakage rate inside the vacuum sealing chambers exceeded the federal standard by a mere 0.002%. To the untrained eye, it was a rounding error. To me, it was a glaring red flag. The backlash was immediate and deafening. The lead assembly technician slammed his clipboard against a steel table and shouted that I was paralyzing the floor over a microscopic ghost. The floor manager stormed into my office, his face red with frustration, grumbling loudly that my paranoia was going to cost them their quarterly shipping bonuses. "You are putting the entire department behind schedule over an invisible fraction. Quinn, release the batch," he demanded, leaning aggressively over my desk. I did not raise my voice, nor did I entertain his demands. I simply maintained eye contact and told him, "The production line will remain frozen until the independent lab verifies the integrity of the materials." Exactly 48 hours later, the laboratory analysis returned. The comprehensive report confirmed my exact suspicions. The materials compromised by that supposedly insignificant leak were proven to degrade at an accelerated rate. Had those pacemakers been approved and shipped, the defective vacuum seals would have allowed bodily fluids to breach the casing, inevitably leading to total electrical failure. Implanting those devices into human patients would have caused massive, fatal heart failure within a matter of months. When the floor manager saw the report, all the color drained from his face. I did not gloat. I did not march down to the assembly floor to demand an apology. I simply sat at my desk, opened the master compliance log on my tablet, and quietly tapped the box labeled "Resolved." Incidents like that cemented my reputation. Within the glass and steel walls of Aegis Biomech, there was a deeply ingrained, unwritten rule whispered among all the departments. It was universally understood that if Quinn Collins knocks on your office door carrying a solid gray folder, your life is about to become a living nightmare. The gray folder meant I had found a discrepancy in your documentation, a flaw in your testing methodology, or a shortcut you thought you could get away with. It meant you were going to cancel your weekend plans, stay late every night, and completely redo that entire month of work under my direct supervision. I saw the fear and the subtle eye rolls whenever I walked into a room. They frequently referred to me as the bureaucracy boss behind closed doors. A title meant to be an insult, painting me as a rigid tyrant obsessed with red tape. I was perfectly content being the villain in their corporate success story because I understood a fundamental truth they chose to ignore. In the highly volatile world of medical technology, bureaucracy is not just paperwork. Strict adherence to the rules is the single, fragile boundary separating a miraculous medical breakthrough from a horrific act of corporate manslaughter. The stability I had brutally enforced for years evaporated the moment our board of directors sold us out. A predatory venture capital firm swooped in, swallowing Aegis Biomech whole. They did not care about medical ethics, patient longevity, or the pristine safety record I had spent 6 years building. They cared only about rapid returns and aggressive corporate restructuring. To execute their vision, they installed a new chief executive officer. His name was Julian Vance. Julian was 42 years old, though he dressed like a college dropout who had just stumbled into a massive cryptocurrency fortune. He swiftly replaced our standard executive dress code with designer sneakers, tight black turtlenecks, and a perpetual smirk of unearned superiority. He operated at a manic, exhausting frequency, flooding the corporate communications network with empty Silicon Valley buzzwords. Every meeting became a chaotic sermon about being agile, driving disruption, and moving at hyperspeed. To Julian, we were not manufacturing life-saving medical devices, we were just building another tech startup. And he treated the fragile human body like a minor software bug waiting to be patched by his infinite genius. His ultimate obsession was our newest project, the Apex 5. It was a revolutionary, next-generation spinal cord implant designed to bridge severed nerve pathways. The stakes could not have been higher. If the technology worked, it would theoretically allow paralyzed patients to walk again. If it failed, it would cause catastrophic, permanent neurological destruction. But Julian did not see vulnerable patients or scientific miracles. He only saw the initial public offering scheduled for the end of Q3. That impending IPO was his golden ticket, a massive financial payout that depended entirely on the Apex 5 hitting the market drastically ahead of schedule. The collision between his reckless ambition and my impenetrable firewall was inevitable. It happened during his second week, inside the glass-walled executive boardroom. I had just submitted the standard compliance timeline for the Apex 5, outlining the mandatory 14-day biological validation protocol required by the Food and Drug Administration. Julian picked up my printed report, held it by the corner as if it were contaminated, and tossed it back onto the mahogany table. "This is completely unacceptable. Quinn," he announced, projecting his voice so every vice president in the room could hear. He paced around the long table, waving his hands theatrically. 14 days of dead time. That is what we call costly systemic friction. We are bleeding momentum every single hour that product sits in a testing vat. We need to be lean. We need to disrupt this archaic timeline. That archaic timeline is federal law. Julian, I replied, keeping my voice completely steady and devoid of emotion. The implant must remain submerged in a synthetic biological environment for 14 days to ensure the casing does not dissolve and leak neurotoxins directly into the spinal fluid of the patient. Julian stopped pacing and leaned heavily on the back of his leather chair, staring at me with a deeply condescending grin. "You are thinking like a dinosaur. We have the most advanced predictive modeling algorithms on the planet. I want you to scrap the physical submersion tests. We are going to shorten the validation window to 4 days by running software simulations instead. The computer will tell us if the casing holds." The entire room went dead silent. Replacing physical biological testing with software simulation on a highly sensitive medical device was not just a sloppy shortcut. It was a severe, blatant violation of federal health and safety laws. It was the exact kind of executive decision that resulted in prolonged prison sentences. "I will not sign the internal clearance for a simulated test," I stated clearly, ensuring my absolute refusal was logged in the minds of every executive present. A computer model cannot legally or scientifically replicate the unpredictable variables of human spinal chemistry. If you push this forward without the physical 14-day validation, you are intentionally jeopardizing human lives. Julian let out a loud, mocking laugh. It was a sharp, ugly sound that echoed off the glass walls. "You really are a relic of a rigid, visionless generation, aren't you? You are so obsessed with ticking your little boxes that you cannot see the future right in front of you. Innovation requires breaking the old rules. Quinn, if you cannot keep up with the hyper-speed of modern business, maybe you do not belong on this rocket ship." He expected me to shrink, to apologize, or to storm out in a fit of righteous anger. I did none of those things. I simply maintained unbroken eye contact, my expression as cold and hard as concrete. "My signature stays off that protocol," I repeated. Julian did not fire me that day. Firing a compliance director right before an IPO would trigger an automatic audit from the regulators, and he was not quite foolish enough to invite that level of scrutiny. Instead, he chose the coward's route. He initiated a shadow war to make me entirely obsolete. Starting that very afternoon, I noticed my administrative access to the central server behaving strangely. Julian secretly revoked my security clearance to the material change reports. I could no longer see the real-time adjustments being made to the Apex 5 manufacturing line. Simultaneously, he began pulling floor managers into private, undocumented meetings. He actively encouraged his subordinates to bypass the compliance department altogether, instructing them to route their daily progress reports directly to his desk. He was building a wall of silence around me, isolating the bureaucracy boss so his reckless sprint to the Q3 IPO could proceed without my interference. He thought he had outsmarted the system by cutting off my visibility. He believed that by blinding the watchdog, he could get away with his systemic fraud. But Julian Vance made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed my silence was a sign of defeat, completely unaware that a firewall does not need to see the hacker to burn him to the ground. Most people expect a loud exit when a career is deliberately derailed. They expect slammed doors, furious emails sent to the entire company, or threats involving high-priced employment lawyers. I gave them absolutely nothing. In the days following my marginalization, I retreated into complete professional silence. I arrived at my office precisely at 8 o'clock in the morning, kept my door firmly shut, and left exactly at 5 in the afternoon. To the casual observer wandering the sterile halls of Aegis Biomech, my quiet compliance looked exactly like a crushing defeat. The whispers in the break room shifted from fear to pity. They assumed the new chief executive officer had successfully broken the iron will of the bureaucracy boss. Julian certainly believed it. He strutted past my glass walls with the arrogant confidence of a conqueror, assuming I was merely riding out my remaining days until I could quietly collect a standard severance package. He profoundly misunderstood my silence. While the rest of the executive team celebrated their newly acquired freedom from my rigorous oversight, I sank into the cold, methodical depths of a digital hunt. I did not need direct access to the main manufacturing logs to see the trail of toxic breadcrumbs Julian was leaving behind. Greed always leaves a distinct signature, and Julian was remarkably sloppy in his desperation. By cross-referencing the monthly utility expenditures of the subterranean production floor with the incoming shipping manifests of industrial protective gear, I uncovered his most egregious sin yet. The power consumption of our heavy radiation chambers had suddenly dropped to zero. I sat in the dark of my office, the blue light of my monitor reflecting off my glasses, feeling a genuine, sickening chill crawl down my spine. Julian had secretly instructed the floor managers to completely bypass the gamma-ray sterilization phase for the initial production run of the Apex 5 implants. The financial motivation driving this madness was terrifyingly simple. Bypassing that crucial safety protocol saved the corporation $300,000 in monthly operational costs. For a man desperately padding the balance sheet for an impending initial public offering, it was an incredibly tempting target. But for the end user, it was an absolute biological nightmare. These devices were not superficial trackers. They were explicitly designed to be surgically embedded directly into the vulnerable, exposed nervous tissue of a human spinal column. Skipping the intense gamma radiation meant microscopic pathogens, machine oil residue, and manufacturing dust would be sewn straight into a living patient. This practically guaranteed untreatable spinal meningitis, permanent paralysis, or an agonizing death within weeks of the operation. At that precise moment, my role fundamentally shifted. I was no longer just an internal auditor trying to enforce company policy against a stubborn administration. I became a silent investigator building a federal criminal case from the inside out. I purchased a military-grade, hardened solid-state drive, and began hoarding every single scrap of data that passed through the internal network routing nodes. I carefully captured the deleted audio files of Julian, leaving late-night voicemails for the factory overseer, explicitly demanding faster turnarounds regardless of the biological contamination risks. I archived the hastily written emails where he mocked the entire sterilization process as an unnecessary financial drain on his visionary timeline. Every digital footprint he tried to casually scrub was resurrected, mathematically verified, and locked away behind impenetrable encryption layers. The drive sat heavy in my tailored suit pocket, a dense block of irrefutable, damning evidence. However, simply possessing the evidence was only half the equation. I needed to ensure the trap was utterly inescapable when it finally triggered. Using my remaining administrative privileges as the compliance director, privileges he forgot to revoke in his haste, I drafted a highly technical, deliberately boring proposal for a routine software update. I titled the document Cloud Data Optimization for the Inventory Management Framework. It was a masterpiece of corporate jargon, consisting of exactly 50 pages of dense technical text specifically designed to make an impatient executive gloss over the vital details. I walked calmly into Julian's corner office and placed the thick document squarely on his desk, keeping my demeanor perfectly subdued and obedient. He barely glanced at me. He was in the middle of a phone call with a prominent venture capitalist, laughing loudly about upcoming profit margins. Annoyed by my minor interruption, he grabbed a heavy fountain pen, flipped directly to the last page, and scrawled his signature on the approval line without reading a single sentence. He handed it back with a dismissive flick of his wrist. He had just unknowingly signed his own professional death warrant. That dense document was not a simple database optimization script. Embedded deep within the back-end code I was now legally authorized to deploy was a direct application programming interface gateway. Once implemented during the midnight maintenance window, this hidden architecture permanently linked Aegis Biomech's internal inventory tracking software straight into the automated criminal monitoring servers of both the Food and Drug Administration and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Every time a barcode was scanned on our assembly floor, a shadow copy of that data was instantly primed for federal law enforcement review. The final, fatal stroke of the trap was a digital dead man's switch. I programmed a deeply buried logic bomb directly into the central quarantine release protocols of the shipping department. The parameters were brutally rigid and impossible to bypass. The system was now hardwired to recognize that the Apex 5 inventory required a specific cryptographic release token before the loading bay doors could legally open. That unique token could only be generated by the physical biometric thumbprint of the compliance director. I established a localized, invisible geofence around the outbound loading docks. If the unsterilized batch of spinal implants crossed that digital threshold without my explicit biometric authorization, the system would not merely log an internal error, it would instantly reclassify the movement as the active smuggling of toxic medical devices and transmit a priority 1 distress signal directly to Washington. The net was woven to perfection. The digital tripwires were pulled tight across every conceivable exit. All that was left to do was sit quietly in the shadows and wait for Julian's insatiable greed to make him take that final, fatal step. The clock was ticking loudly in the dark, and only I possessed the power to hear the countdown. The atmosphere inside the executive boardroom on the top floor of Aegis Biomech was thick enough to choke on. It was the morning of our finalized Q3 distribution summit. The massive mahogany table was surrounded by the company board of directors, while the oversized digital screens mounted on the walls displayed the live video feeds of our top-tier national distributors. The air conditioning was humming loudly, pumping freezing air into the room, yet a suffocating tension hung over every chair. We were at the precipice of the largest financial maneuver in the history of the corporation. Sitting down in the subterranean loading bays, perfectly packaged and strapped to wooden pallets, was the initial commercial batch of the Apex 5 implants. That single shipment represented $45 million in immediate projected revenue. It was the lifeblood of Julian Vance's highly anticipated initial public offering. Julian stood at the head of the table, bathed in the glow of the projection screen. He was completely in his element, practically vibrating with adrenaline as he delivered a passionate, aggressive sales pitch to the faces on the monitors. He spoke of revolutionizing neurological recovery, dominating the market share, and crushing the competition. The board members nodded in rhythmic agreement, hypnotized by the promise of unprecedented quarterly dividends. But Julian was a man whose ego demanded absolute, unquestionable dominance. He did not just want to win. He needed to publicly humiliate the one person who had dared to stand in his way. He needed a theatrical display of my submission to assure the investors that his ship was sailing with perfect compliance. He paused his presentation and turned his predatory gaze directly toward my chair at the far end of the long table. The boardroom grew uncomfortably quiet as all eyes shifted to me. Julian picked up the master logistics tablet, the digital gateway that controlled the automated loading dock bays downstairs. "We have engineered a miracle, ladies and gentlemen," Julian announced smoothly, his voice dripping with synthetic charm. "But a miracle means nothing if we cannot deliver it to the patients who desperately need it. Aegis Biomech operates on total internal unity. Every department moves as one." He walked slowly down the length of the room and placed the heavy tablet directly in front of me. "Quinn, as our esteemed Director of Compliance, the board would love to see you officially clear the system. Swipe your badge. Authorize the internal customs clearance for the Apex 5 shipment. Let us show our distribution partners that our regulatory team stands proudly behind this launch." It was an ambush designed to trap me in front of the most powerful people connected to the company. If I swiped my badge, I would be legally complicit in the distribution of biologically hazardous materials. If I refused, I would look like a rogue, hysterical employee sabotaging a historical medical breakthrough. I did not break eye contact with him. I placed my hands flat on the polished mahogany surface and slowly stood up. The silence in the room deepened, becoming heavy and brittle. I looked past Julian, deliberately directing my voice to the camera lens transmitting to the major distributors. "I cannot authorize this clearance," I stated, my voice echoing clearly off the glass walls. "The entire inventory currently sitting in the outbound warehouse poses a severe, undocumented risk of biological cross-contamination. Releasing those pallets directly violates Section 402 of the federal regulations regarding implantable medical devices. That shipment is completely unfit for human surgical use." The reaction was instantaneous. The boardroom absolutely flatlined. One of the senior board members gasped out loud, dropping his expensive pen onto the table with a sharp clatter. On the video screens, the lead distributors exchanged panicked, confused glances, immediately leaning closer to their microphones. The carefully constructed illusion of Julian's perfect corporate machine shattered into a million jagged pieces in a matter of 5 seconds. Julian turned a deep, violent shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged as the blood rushed to his head. He had expected me to cower under the immense social pressure of the boardroom. He never anticipated that I would detonate a bomb directly in the middle of his crowning achievement. His mask of the charming, visionary leader melted away, revealing the terrified, volatile tyrant underneath. "You are out of your mind," Julian roared. The volume of his voice shook the glass partitions. He slammed his open palms down onto the table so hard that the crystal water glasses rattled. He pointed a trembling finger inches from my face. "You are a psychopathic saboteur. You have spent weeks trying to destroy this launch because your fragile ego cannot handle the speed of modern innovation. I will not let a bureaucratic parasite sink this company." He violently snatched the logistics tablet right out from under my hands. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with rage as he frantically tapped the screen. "I am the Chief Executive Officer," he spat, his eyes wide with frantic desperation. "I have supreme administrative authority. I do not need your permission to save this company." Julian aggressively bypassed the standard departmental security protocols. The screen flashed a bright yellow warning, asking for confirmation to override the biometric lock of the compliance director. Without a single moment of hesitation, Julian punched in his personal master passcode. He slammed his finger down on the final confirmation button. A loud, synthetic beep resonated from the tablet, signaling that the digital gates to the loading dock had been forced open by executive command. He tossed the tablet aside and glared at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. He straightened his tailored jacket, trying to regain his composure in front of the horrified board of directors. "You are fired, Quinn," Julian commanded, his voice shaking with venom. "Immediately, leave your security badge on that desk and get the hell out of my building before I have security drag you out by your hair." The entire room watched me with bated breath, anticipating a meltdown, a plea for mercy, or a screaming match. I gave them absolutely nothing. I did not shed a single tear. I did not offer a single word of defense or explanation. I maintained a posture of absolute terrifying calm. I reached up, unclipped the plastic security lanyard from my collar, and placed it squarely and neatly next to the logistics tablet. I smoothed the lapels of my blazer, looked Julian directly in his furious eyes, and offered him an incredibly unreadable, chilling smile. "I wish you a memorable product launch, Julian," I said softly, the words slicing through the heavy silence of the room. I turned my back on the chief executive officer, the stunned board of directors, and the panicked distributors on the screens. I walked toward the heavy wooden doors with measured, deliberate steps, knowing with absolute certainty that I was leaving a graveyard behind me. I stepped out of the heavy glass doors of the lobby and into the crisp Denver morning air. The sun was bright, blindingly reflecting off the sleek, modern exterior of the corporate headquarters. I walked deliberately toward my car in the executive parking lot, my heels clicking rhythmically against the pristine pavement. There was a profound stillness in those few seconds, the deep breath before the plunge. I reached my sedan, unlocked the door, and just as my hand grasped the handle, the deafening shriek of the industrial emergency sirens violently shattered the quiet morning. It was not the standard, rhythmic pulse of a fire alarm. It was the distinct, piercing, continuous howl of a total facility lockdown, a sound designed to induce immediate panic. I did not get into my car. Instead, I turned around, leaned casually against the door, and watched the spectacle unfold. Every single exterior light emitting diode strip lining the massive glass facade of the building instantly shifted from a cool corporate blue to a violent, strobing red. The trap I had so carefully constructed had officially snapped shut. Up in the executive boardroom, the arrogant victory Julian had tasted mere seconds ago was rapidly turning into ash in his mouth. He was still standing by the head of the mahogany table, his chest puffed out in defiance, when the environment abruptly turned against him. The massive presentation monitors mounted on the walls behind him abruptly cut the live feeds of the panicked distributors. The screens went entirely black for a fraction of a second, plunging the room into a momentary, terrifying darkness. Then, they flashed to life with a massive, pulsating red background. Large, bold white text illuminated the terrified faces of the board of directors. The text read, "Diagnostic error, Level 1 violation, system locked." The board members erupted into chaos. shouting questions and demanding explanations, but Julian could not hear them over the ringing in his ears. He stared at the glowing letters, his smirk melting into absolute bewilderment. He slammed his hand against the logistics tablet still sitting on the table, frantically swiping and tapping, desperately trying to refresh the screen to regain the supreme control he thought he possessed. But the tablet was entirely dead, frozen on a severe biometric failure screen that refused to accept his credentials. He did not realize that by using his chief executive override to force the release of an unverified medical shipment, he had crossed the single, invisible digital tripwire I had meticulously laid across the network. The application programming interface I had secretly embedded in the system did exactly what it was designed to do, reacting with cold, mathematical precision. It recognized that the biometric signature belonging to the compliance director was missing from a high-risk outbound order. But here was the most devastating twist: the hidden mechanism that would ensure his total, inescapable ruin. The smart security network governing the physical locks, automated doors, and surveillance systems of the Aegis Biomech facility was no longer under the jurisdiction of our private corporate security firm. That massive 50-page technical document I had handed him last month, the one titled Cloud Data Optimization, which he had blindly signed without reading a single word to avoid a minor inconvenience, contained a deeply buried, legally binding authorization clause. His hasty signature had officially and legally transferred the primary override controls of our entire security infrastructure directly to the rapid response grid of the federal law enforcement agencies. He had quite literally handed the keys to his own prison to the federal government. Down in the subterranean loading bays, the consequences of his arrogance were immediate and catastrophic. The massive electronic steel rolling doors of the warehouse slammed down with bone-rattling force, hitting the concrete floor so hard it shook the foundations. Heavy, automated deadbolts engaged with loud, mechanical clanks, permanently sealing the exits. The idling delivery trucks, fully loaded with the contaminated Apex 5 implants, were completely caged inside the loading bays. The drivers honked their horns in confusion, trapped in the red glow of the emergency lights. Simultaneously, the automated robotic production lines on the factory floor instantly severed their own power supplies, grinding millions of dollars of complex machinery to a dead, sparking halt. The entire manufacturing heart of the company was paralyzed. Julian, dripping with cold, terrified sweat, pulled out his smartphone. His hands were shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the device as he frantically dialed the emergency extension for the Information Technology Department. He paced the length of the boardroom like a caged animal, ignoring the shouting board members. When the lead network engineer finally answered, Julian screamed into the receiver, demanding they manually override the lockdown, cut the alarms, and open the warehouse doors immediately. He threatened to fire the entire department if they did not comply. The voice that came back through the speaker was hollow, echoing with sheer, helpless terror. "Boss, we have absolutely no control," the engineer stammered, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. "We are completely locked out of the mainframe. Every admin credential has been revoked. The servers are currently reporting all internal data directly to Washington." Precisely 1 hour after I walked out of the sliding glass doors of Aegis Biomech, the consequences of Julian Vance's greed arrived at the front gate. The wailing of the facility lockdown sirens was suddenly drowned out by the heavy, aggressive screeching of thick rubber tires on asphalt. 3 heavily armored, matte black sport utility vehicles violently mounted the front curb, throwing the pristine corporate landscaping into disarray. The doors flew open before the vehicles even came to a complete stop. A swarm of federal agents representing the Food and Drug Administration Office of Criminal Investigations, heavily backed by armed United States Marshals, poured out into the blinding morning sun. They moved with absolute, terrifying precision. They did not pause at the reception desk to sign the visitor log. They stormed the grand marble lobby, their heavy tactical boots echoing like a drumbeat of doom against the polished stone floors. They moved in perfect tactical formation, completely ignoring the frantic, confused screams of the corporate security guards who were utterly powerless to stop a federal raid. Up on the top floor, the executive boardroom had become a tomb of panic. Julian was still frantically yelling at the information technology department on his phone when the heavy mahogany doors were kicked open. A senior federal agent strode into the room, his hand resting securely on his tactical belt. He did not ask for permission to speak. He simply approached the head of the table, grabbed Julian roughly by the shoulder, and slammed him against the glass wall. The cold, heavy steel of handcuffs clicked shut around Julian's wrists with a sharp, echoing snap that silenced the entire room. "Julian Vance," the senior agent barked, his voice carrying the absolute weight of the United States government. "You are under federal arrest for the intentional distribution of hazardous medical devices and the deliberate falsification of biological safety records." Julian went entirely limp, his face drained of every ounce of color. He looked like a deflated balloon, all his Silicon Valley arrogance completely stripped away in an instant. Down on the manufacturing floor, the scene was just as chaotic. The floor manager, who had once demanded I release the defective pacemakers, was marched out of the building in handcuffs. Every single board member and vice president who had aligned themselves with Julian's reckless vision was detained in the cafeteria for intense, immediate interrogation. The financial bleeding was instantaneous. As news of the federal raid leaked to the trading floors, the internal stock valuation of Aegis Biomech went into a catastrophic, vertical freefall. The massive financial payout Julian had promised his investors evaporated into thin air. Within a single morning, millions of dollars of projected revenue turned into absolutely worthless paper. Back in the boardroom, the senior agent pulled a massive, incredibly thick physical folder from his briefcase and threw it onto the mahogany table right in front of Julian's trembling hands. Stamped across the front in massive, bold letters were the words, "Automated Evidence Update." Julian stared at it in sheer horror. Every single page inside that folder, every deleted voicemail, every hidden email, and every bypassed safety protocol bore the certified digital signature of Quinn Collins. I had not sent it as a disgruntled employee. I had submitted it fully and legally in my capacity as an authorized protector of federal law. Directly across the street from the unfolding chaos, I was sitting on the quiet, sunlit patio of a small, independent coffee shop. The jazz music playing from the overhead speakers was a sharp, pleasant contrast to the distant shouting. I picked up my tall glass of iced Americano, feeling the cool condensation against my skin, and took a slow, deeply satisfying sip. My phone softly vibrated against the wooden table. I glanced down at the screen. It was a highly encrypted email directly from the United States Department of Justice. The message was brief, expressing profound gratitude for my impeccably documented service, and attached at the bottom was a formal, highly lucrative offer to join their division as a regional director of inspections. I looked through the wrought iron fence of the patio and watched the grand finale of my morning. Two heavily armed marshals were forcefully guiding a handcuffed, broken Julian Vance out of the grand lobby and shoving him into the dark, windowless back of a federal transport van. I set my coffee down, reached into my leather tote bag, and pulled out my personal notebook. I took a heavy ink pen and drew a single, thick, dark line straight through the name, Julian Vance. People like him never understand the true purpose of my profession until it is entirely too late. They hired me to ensure that absolutely everything within that building complied with the proper procedures, and the waste disposal procedure today operated flawlessly. Thank you so much, from the bottom of our hearts, for listening to Boss Revenge Stories today. We would absolutely love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please let us know in the comments. If you found today's story satisfying and entertaining, please help us keep this channel alive by joining our Patreon community. There, you can listen to the absolute best, highly exclusive, true revenge stories that are simply too intense and detailed for us to publish publicly on YouTube. You can easily support us by scanning the Patreon QR code currently displayed on your screen, or by clicking the direct link provided in the description box and the pinned comment below. We appreciate you, and we will see you in the next story.